Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. This deck achieves victory by repeatedly using Grey Merchant or executing a storm strategy through life gain engines. It has the advantage of including high-cost tutors and distinctive cards that aren't typically found in other black CEDH decks, thanks to Kirik's special form of Mana Ramp. The deck is capable of consistently threatening wins on turns 3 through 5, supported by multiple one-card win con enablers. Charles had the best Mermaid makeover and gets to start us off. Charles draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He passes. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Mana Ball. He casts Wheel of Misfortune. In response, Charles casts Enlightened Tutor. He fetches up a Deafening Silence onto the top of his library. Then Wheel resolves. Everyone chooses a number, with Charles and Alex choosing 0, Peter choosing 3, and Ashani choosing 10. Then Ashani takes 10, and then Peter and Ashani discard their hand and draw 7. With nothing else, Ashani ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Blood Celebrant. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He activates Blood Celebrant 3 times, paying 9 life through Kirik, adding 3 black. He pays 4 life through Kirik to cast Final Parting. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Then Peter fetches up a Grey Merchant of Asphodel into his graveyard and Chainer Dimension Master into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant 3 times, paying 9 life, adding 3 black. He pays 4 more life to help cast Dark Petition. Kirik gets a counter, and then he fetches up a card into his hand, adding 3 black. He pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Animate Dead, targeting Grey Merchant in his graveyard. Kirik gets a counter, then Grey Merchant enters the battlefield. Grey Merchant triggers, with each opponent losing 7 and Peter gaining 21. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor. Kirik gets a counter, and then he fetches up a card into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant 3 times, paying 9 life, adding 3 black. He pays 4 life to help cast CEDH, Undead Vizier. Kirik gets a counter, and then CEDH enters. Peter exploits CEDH, sacrificing Grey Merchant and fetching up a card into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He pays 2 more life to cast Dance of the Dead, targeting Grey Merchant. Kirik gets a counter, then Grey Merchant enters the battlefield. Merchant triggers, and each opponent loses 9, and Peter gains 27. He activates Blood Celebrant 2 times, paying 6 life, adding 2 black. He pays 4 more life to cast Flesh Writher, and Kirik gets a counter. He activates Blood Celebrant 2 times, paying 6 life, adding 2 black. He pays 2 more life to cast Yawgmoth's Will, and Kirik gets a counter. He activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He pays 2 more to cast Demonic Tutor from his graveyard. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He activates Blood Celebrant twice, paying 6 life, adding 2 black. He pays 2 more to cast Saw in Half, targeting Grey Merchant. Kirik gets a counter, then Saw in Half resolves. Grey Merchant is destroyed, and Peter creates 2 copies. Each enter with a devotion of 12, Peter gains 48, each opponent loses 24, dies, and Peter wins the game. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards, and they save me tons of time. They have 3 main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Alex draws and starts off by casting Chrome Mox, imprinting Tishana, Voice of Thunder. He plays a Rejuvenating Springs for turn. He casts an Elvish Mystic. Alex passes. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Lotus Petal. Peter ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Luxury Suite. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Ashani ships the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a snow-covered plains. He casts Grafdigger's Cage, much to the dismay of most of the table. Charles gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Rhystic Study. Alex ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Homeward Path. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Peter pays 2 life through Kirik to cast Blood Pet. Kirik and Rhystic trigger, Alex draws, and Kirik gets a counter. Finished up, Peter passes. Ashani draws, plays an Ancient Tomb, and passes. Charles draws and casts Land Tax. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Charles passes. Alex draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. Alex ends his turn. Peter draws and starts off by paying 6 life through Kirik to cast Beseech the Queen, paying the Rhystic Tax. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a Demonic Tutor into his hand. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor, paying the Rhystic Tax. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Dark Ritual. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter pays for Rhystic. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter pays 6 life to help cast Peer into the Abyss, paying the Rhystic Tax, and Kirik gets a counter. In response, Ashani casts Dark Ritual. Rhystic triggers, and Alex draws. Then Ashani adds 3 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Ad Naus resolves, and Ashani reveals a Misty Rainforest, Otawara Soaring City, Mana Vault, Jataxian Probe, Wheel of Misfortune, Mana Confluence, Dispel, Badlands, Mystic Remora, Windfall, Talisman of Creativity, Toxic Deluge, Brain Freeze, Chrome Mox, Snap, Underground Sea, Rhystic Study, Ranger Captain of Eos, Dockside Extortionist, Dramatic Reversal, Verdant Catacombs, Plateau, Silence, Chain of Vapor, Red Elemental Blast, Jeweled Lotus, and a Dothi Voidwalker, deciding to stop there. Unfortunately, he did not find any free interaction, and Peer resolves. Peter draws half of his library and loses half of his life, rounded up. Peter plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts an Aetherflux Reservoir. He casts Mox Amber. Alex draws through Rhystic, and Peter gains 7 life through Aetherflux. Peter pays 2 life to cast Reign of Filth. Kirik, Aetherflux, and Rhystic all trigger. Alex draws through Rhystic, Peter gains 8 life, and then Kirik gets a counter. In response, Alex casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Reign of Filth. Peter pays 2 life to cast Blood Celebrant. Alex draws, Kirik gets a counter, and Peter gains 9 life. He activates Blood Celebrant 4 times, paying 12 life, adding 4 black. He pays 4 more life to help cast Professor Onyx. Kirik, Aetherflux, and Rhystic all trigger. Peter pays 3 life through Blood Celebrant to pay for Rhystic. Peter gains 10 life through Aetherflux, and then Kirik gets a counter. Then Onyx resolves. Peter activates Blood Celebrant, paying 3 life, adding a black. He casts Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Kirik, Aetherflux, Professor Onyx, and Rhystic all trigger. Peter pays 3 life through Blood Celebrant to pay for Rhystic. Each opponent loses 2 and Peter gains 2 through Onyx. Peter gains 11 life through Aetherflux, then Kirik gets a counter. With no answers, Chain of Smog resolves. Peter discards 2 cards and copies the chain, targeting himself. Each time he copies the chain, Professor Onyx triggers and each opponent loses 2 life. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Liliana had the most on-theme playmat and gets to start us off. But Alex has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Reclamation Sage. Liliana draws a card for turn and plays a Swamp. She casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. She casts Night's Whisper, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life. She casts a Blood Pet and passes the turn. Skylar draws and plays a City of Brass. They tap it to cast a Soul Ring. They cast Mox Opal. They cast a Lotus Petal. They cast Ponder. They look at the top 3, don't like what they see, shuffle, and draw. They cast a Jeweled Lotus. They cast her commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. They move to Crombat and attack Liliana with Crom. Liliana takes it, and Skylar passes the turn. Alex draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tropical Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Thought Vessel and gives the turn to Sage. Sage draws and casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. They sack their Lion's Eye Diamond, discard their hand, and cast their commander, Bergi, God of Storytelling. Crom triggers and Skylar draws. All in and all through, Sage passes. Liliana draws and taps a Swamp for black, then plays Lake of the Dead, sacrificing her Swamp. She casts Sign in Blood, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life. Liliana ends her turn. Skylar draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. They cast a Mana Crypt. They cast their commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools. They activate Tevesh's first ability, creating 2 Thralls. They move to combat and attack Liliana with Crom. Liliana takes it, and Skylar ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Alex gives the turn to Sage. Sage draws and moves to combat. They attack Tevesh with Bergi. Skylar blocks with a Thrall, and Sage passes the turn. Liliana draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Liliana's turn, Skylar taps their City of Brass to cast Vampiric Tutor. They fetch up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. The turn moves to Skylar. During their upkeep, Skylar loses their mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. They draw and tap their City of Brass to cast Displacer Kitten. They activate Tevish's first ability. In response, Liliana casts Victim of Night, targeting Displacer Kitten. In response, Skylar casts Cut Down, targeting Alex's Kitten. Kitten triggers, targeting itself. Kitten's ability resolves, flickering itself. Then Cut Down resolves, Kitten is destroyed, and then Victim of Night fizzles. Then Tevish's ability resolves, and Skylar creates 2 thralls. Unfortunately thwarted though, Skylar has to pass. Alex draws and casts Phyrexian Revoker. It enters, and Alex names Tevish Zot, much to the dismay of Skylar. With nothing else, Alex passes to Sage. Sage draws and moves to combat. They attack Tevish with Burgi. Tevish takes it, and Sage gives the turn to Liliana. Liliana draws, takes no actions, and passes. During their upkeep, Skylar wins their mana crypt roll. They draw and cast Imperial Seal. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then Skylar fetches up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. They cast Wheel of Fortune. Kitten triggers, targeting Mox Opal. In response, Sage casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Kitten's trigger. Burgi triggers, adding a red. Then Swat resolves, redirecting the Kitten trigger to one of Skylar's thralls. Then Kitten's trigger resolves, flickering a thrall, removing it entirely. Then Wheel resolves, and everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Skylar plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. They cast Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Phyrexian Revoker. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then Phyrexian Revoker is exiled. Next, Skylar activates Tevish's second ability, sacrificing a thrall, drawing 2 cards. They cast Mox Diamond. Kitten triggers, flickering Tevish Zot. Then Mox Diamond resolves, and Skylar discards Command Tower. They activate Tevish's first ability, since it is now a new instance of Tevish, creating 2 thralls. They cast Entomb. Kitten triggers and flickers Tevish. Then Entomb resolves, and Skylar fetches up a Brain Freeze into their graveyard. They cast Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, targeting Mox Opal. In response, Alex evokes Endurance, exiling a green card. In response, to save their turn, Skylar casts Swansong on their own Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, flickering Soul Ring. In response, Sage casts Pyroblast, targeting Swansong. Burgi triggers and adds a red. Then Pyroblast counters Swansong. With Endurance still on the stack, Skylar casts Ad Nauseam. Kitten triggers, flickering Soul Ring. Then Ad Naus resolves, and Skylar reveals a Spell Pierce, Steam Vents, Force of Will, Rhystic Study, Gemstone Caverns, Wooded Foothills, Mental Misstep, Fatal Push, Morphic Pool, Brainstorm, Deflecting Swat, Unsubstantiate, Demonic Tutor, Mindbreak Trap, Rite of Flame, and Athas's Oracle, deciding to stop there. Then Endurance resolves, triggers, and targets Skylar. In response, Skylar casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Endurance's ability. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then Swat resolves, redirecting the ability to Liliana. Then the ability resolves, and Liliana puts her graveyard onto the bottom of her library in a random order. Next, Skylar casts Rite of Flame. Kitten triggers, flickering Tevish. Then Skylar adds 2 red. They escape Wheel of Fortune. Kitten flickers Soul Ring, then everyone discards their hand and draws 7. Skylar activates Tevish's second ability, sacrificing a thrall, drawing 2 cards. They cast Mana Vault. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. They cast Felwar Stone, and Kitten flickers Mana Vault. They escape Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting themselves. Kitten triggers, flickering Mox Opal. Then they mill the rest of their library. They escape Chrome Mox, imprinting Stern Dismissal. They escape Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Skylar wins the game. But Alex has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Nature's Claim. Skylar draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. They cast a Soul Ring and pass the turn. Alex draws and plays an Island. He also casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Priest of Titania. Alex ends his turn. Sage draws and plays a Mountain. They cast Flamekin Harbinger. It enters, and Sage searches their library for a Grinning Ignis, putting it on top. They exile Simian Spirit Guide from their hand, adding a red. They cast Infernal Plunge, sacrificing Flamekin, adding 3 red. They cast their commander, Burgi, God of Storytelling. They cast Mox Amber. Burgi triggers, adding a red. They cast Sensei's Divining Top, adding a red through Burgi. They activate Sensei's Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. All through, and with an explosive turn 1, Sage passes. Liliana draws and plays a City of Traders. She casts a Soul Ring. She casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Liliana passes. Skylar draws and plays a Volcanic Island. They cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. They cast their commander, Crom, Ludovic's Opus. They move to combat and attack Sage with Crom. Sage takes it, and Skylar ends their turn. Alex draws and starts off by casting his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Bloom Tender. Crom triggers, and Skylar draws. He casts Sylvan Library. Alex gives the turn to Sage. At the end of Alex's turn, Liliana activates Sensei's Top, rearranging the top 3. Then Liliana pays 4 life to cast Dismember, targeting Burgi. In response, Sage activates Sensei's Top, rearranging the top 3. They activate Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. They cast Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Dismember. With no responses, Swat resolves, redirecting Dismember to Kinnan. Kinnan dies, and the turn moves to Sage. Sage draws and casts Sensei's Divining Top. Burgi triggers and adds a red. Sage activates Top, rearranging the top 3. They move to combat, attacking Alex with Burgi. Alex takes it, and Sage ships the turn to Liliana. Liliana draws and floats mana from City of Traders. She plays a swamp, sacrificing City of Traders. She pays 6 life to cast her commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. She casts Mox Amber. Crom triggers and Skylar draws. Liliana passes. Skylar draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. They crack it, pay life, and fetch up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. They cast Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and Skylar creates 7 treasures. They cast Desperate Ritual, adding 3 red. They cast Vampiric Tutor. They fetch up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. They cast Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. They cast Displacer Kitten. They cast Geist Wave, targeting their Sol Ring. Kitten triggers, targeting Dockside. In response, Liliana pays 4 life to cast Snuff Out, targeting Dockside. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. In response, Skylar casts Brain Freeze with all copies targeting themselves. Kitten triggers, targeting Dockside. In response, Liliana activates Sensei's Top, looking for an answer. She looks at and rearranges the top 3. Then she activates Top, drawing a card and putting Top on top. Then, with no other answers, Kitten's ability resolves. Dockside flickers, creating 6 treasures. Then Brain Freeze mills some of Skylar's library. Then Snuff Out and the first Kitten trigger fizzles. Then Geist Wave resolves, Sol Ring bounces, and Skylar draws a card. Skylar recasts Sol Ring. Kitten triggers, flickering Dockside, creating 6 more treasures. They cast Talisman of Dominance, and Kitten flickers Dockside again. They cast their commander, Tevesh Zot, Doom of Fools, flickering Dockside through Kitten. They activate Tevesh's second ability, sacrificing Crom, drawing 3 cards. They cast Underworld Breach. Kitten triggers, flickering Tevesh Zot. Skylar presents a loop of escaping Brain Freeze, triggering Kitten, flickering Dockside, creating treasures, and milling their entire library. They escape Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Skylar wins the game. Nick won the egg holding contest and gets to start us off. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Savannah. He casts a Dryad Militant, much to the dismay of Peter and Noah. Nick passes. Peter draws and plays a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. He casts a Mana Vault and passes. Ryan draws and plays a Sandstone Needle into play tapped. Ryan ends his turn. Noah draws and plays a Training Center. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah ships the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Hushbringer. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dryad Militant. Peter takes it, and Nick gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a City of Traders. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 6 life through Kirik to help cast Beseech the Queen. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He fetches up an Entomb into his hand. He pays 2 life to help cast Entomb. Kirik triggers and gets another counter. He fetches up a Villas, Broker of Blood, into his graveyard. Peter pays 2 life to cast Reanimate, targeting Villas. Villas enters the battlefield and Peter loses 8 life. Since Villas sees this life loss, Villas triggers and Peter draws 8 cards. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Ancient Tomb. He pays 4 life to help cast Sheoldred, the Apocalypse. Villas triggers and Peter draws 4. He pays 2 life to cast Dark Ritual. Villas triggers and Peter draws 2 cards. Sheoldred triggers and Peter gains 4 life. Then Peter adds 3 black. Peter pays 2 life through Kirik and 2 life to activate Villas, targeting Hushbringer. Villas triggers and Peter draws 4. Sheoldred triggers and Peter gains 8 life. Then Hushbringer gets -1/-1. Peter does this again, paying 4 life, drawing 4 cards, then gaining 8 life through Sheoldred. Hushbringer then gets another -1/-1, killing it. Peter casts a Sol Ring. He activates Villas, paying 4 life, targeting Krark. Villas triggers, Peter draws 4, Sheoldred triggers, and Peter gains 8. With the trigger still in the stack, he repeats this process over and over, drawing a total of 40 cards and gaining a total of 80 life. Then all the triggers resolve, and Krark dies. Peter casts Lotus Petal. He pays 2 life to cast Reign of Filth, drawing 2 through Villas and gaining 4 life through Sheoldred. He pays 4 life to help cast Professor Onyx, drawing 4 and gaining 8. He casts Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Professor Onyx triggers and drains everyone for 1. Chain of Smog resolves, Peter discards 2 and then continues the chain, targeting himself. He does this over and over, draining the table through Professor Onyx every time Chain of Smog is copied, and Peter wins the game. But Ryan and Noah have pre-game actions. Ryan puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Pyroblast. Noah also puts the Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling a mountain. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Emergence Zone. He pays 6 life and cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 4 life through Kirik to cast Dothy Voidwalker. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Peter ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Grim Monolith. He casts a Mox Opal. Ryan passes. Noah draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He casts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He passes. Nick draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Birds of Paradise. Nick ships the turn. Peter draws and plays a Beseiju, who shelters all, into play tapped. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Dothy and Kirik. Ryan takes it and Peter gains 3 life. Peter ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts a Mana Vault. He casts Thrill of Possibility, discarding Fork and drawing 2 cards. Fork and Thrill of Possibility are exiled under Thothy Voidwalker, and Ryan passes the turn. Noah draws and plays an island. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. It enters as a copy of Krark. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Krark. Peter takes it, and Noah passes to Nick. Nick draws and casts an Esper Sentinel. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast Crop Rotation, sacrificing Mana Confluence as an additional cost. He fetches up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. He casts a Bloom Tender. Nick passes. At the end of Nick's turn, Peter casts Cut Down, targeting Krark. Krark dies, and the turn moves to Peter. Peter draws and taps his Beseiju to cast Soul Ring. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Kirik. Ryan takes it, and Peter gains 4 life. Peter ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Buried Ruin, and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Noah cycles Step Through, fetching up a Spellseeker into his hand. Noah draws and casts Spellseeker. It enters, and he fetches up a Snap into his hand. He attacks Peter with Sakashima. Peter takes it, and Noah passes. Nick draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Utopia Sprawl, naming red as it enters. He casts his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Esper Sentinel and Bloom Tender. Peter takes it, and Nick ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and casts Balthor the Defiled. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Helm of the Host onto the battlefield. He activates Helm, targeting Godo. In response, Nick flashes in a Cathar Commando. He then sacks Cathar Commando, destroying Helm of the Host. Then Helm of the Host goes into exile through Thothy Voidwalker with a Void counter on it. Ryan, with very little way out of this mess, passes to Noah. Noah draws and casts Snap, targeting Jetmir. Krark triggers, Noah wins the flip, copying Snap, targeting Spellseeker. In response, Peter activates Thothy Voidwalker, sacrificing it, casting Ryan's Fork for free, targeting Snap. Fork resolves, creating a copy of Snap, targeting Noah's Krark. Peter taps his Beseiju, floating mana, then Snap resolves, Krark bounces, and Peter untaps 2 lands. Then Noah taps his Shivan Reef, floating mana, Spellseeker bounces, and Noah untaps 2 lands. Then Noah floats mana, then the original Snap resolves, bounces Jetmir, and then Noah untaps 2 lands again. He casts Stormkiln Artist. He taps his Shivan Reef to cast Gamble. Stormkiln triggers, and Noah creates a treasure. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Spellseeker. He casts Brainstorm and creates a treasure through Stormkiln. He draws 3 and then puts 2 back on top. He casts Ponder and creates a treasure again. He looks at the top 3, doesn't like what he sees, shuffles, and draws. He plays a Fiery Islet for turn. Finished up, Noah passes. Nick draws and plays a Champion of Lambholt. He casts a Vren Wingmare. Champion of Lambholt triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. Nick passes. Peter draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his draw step, Ryan takes the damage from his Mana Ball. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain for turn. He casts a Lotus Petal, paying the Esper tax. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Godo. Godo triggers, Ryan untaps it, and gains an extra combat. Peter blocks Godo with Kirik, Godo dies, and Peter gains 5 life. Finished up, Ryan ends his turn. Noah draws and taps his Fiery Islet to help recast his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Noah passes. Nick draws and also recasts his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels. Champion triggers and gets a counter. He casts Feyburrow Elder, and Champion gets a counter again. He casts a Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Vren Wingmare and Noah with Esper Sentinel, Bloom Tender, and Champion of Lambholt. Champion prevents anyone from blocking, so they both take the hit. All through, Nick gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse. He passes. At the end of Peter's turn, Ryan pays to untap his Grim Monolith. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage from his Mana Ball. Sheoldred triggers and Ryan loses 2 life. In his main phase, he plays a Sandstone Needle into play tapped. He recasts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. It enters and he fetches up a Hammer of Nazan onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers and Ryan attaches it to Godo. Ryan passes. During his draw step, Noah loses 2 life to Sheoldred. In his main phase, Noah casts Underworld Breach. Esper triggers and Nick draws. Sheoldred triggers and Nick loses 2 life. Noah escapes Gamble. Krark and Stormkiln trigger. Noah creates a treasure, and with the Krark trigger still on the stack, Peter pays 6 life through Kirik to activate Balthor, exiling it and returning all black and red creatures from the graveyard to the battlefield, which is his Thothy Voidwalker. Then Noah wins his flip, copies Gamble, and creates a treasure through Stormkiln. Then Noah fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Tibalt's Trickery into exile through Thothy. Then the original resolves and he fetches up a card into his hand and randomly discards Swansong into exile. Noah pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe, targeting Peter. He creates a treasure through Stormkiln, then loses his Krark flip, returning Jataxian Probe to his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Jataxian Probe again. He creates a treasure, then loses his flip again, returning it to his hand. He pays 2 life to cast it again. He creates a treasure, then loses again, bouncing it back to his hand. He pays 2 life again to cast it again. He creates a treasure and, you guessed it, loses again, bouncing it back to his hand. Not one to back down from a challenge, he pays 2 life to cast it yet again. Stormkill triggers and creates a treasure, then Noah finally wins his flip, copying it, targeting Ryan. Stormkiln triggers and creates a treasure. He looks at Ryan's hand and draws a card. Sheoldred triggers and Noah loses 2 life. He then looks at Peter's hand and draws a card, which attacks the Probe, getting exiled under Dothy. Sheoldred triggers and Noah loses 2 life again. Noah plays a mountain and, unfortunately stopped in his attempt, passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. During his upkeep, Nick wins its Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he loses 2 life through Sheoldred. He plays a Temple Garden into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Basri Ket. He activates Basri's second ability. Nick moves to combat and attacks Noah with Champion of Lamholt, Jetmir, and Vryn Wingmare, and attacks Ryan with Birds of Paradise, Esper Sentinel, Bloomtender, and Feyburrow Elder. Basri triggers, creating 7 1/1 soldiers, all attacking Peter. Champion of Lamholt triggers 7 times, getting 7 +1/+1 counter. Now no one can block due to the Champion of Lamholt, and since Jetmir gives all of Nick's creatures +3/+0, Vigilance, Trample, and Double Strike, they all take it, die to combat damage, and Nick wins the game. Drake's name showed up in the most magic lore, so he gets to start us off. Drake draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch and ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Homeward Path. He passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Portable Hole. It enters and exiles Drake's Ignoble Hierarch. Charles gives the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Talisman of Indulgence. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He taps his Mana Confluence to cast an Elvish Mystic. With an excellent turn 1 setup, Ashani passes to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Crystal Vein as his land for turn. Punished from a mulligan to 4, he gives the turn to Charles. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He passes. At the end of Charles' turn, Ashani taps his Talisman to cast a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Still in the end step, Charles channels Touch the Spirit Realm, targeting Ashani's Mana Crypt. Touch resolves, Crypt exiles, and the turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Underworld Breach. He sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus, adding 3 red. He sacrifices Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 black. He casts his commander, Corvold, Fakehurst King. Corvold enters and he sacrifices Elvish Mystic. Corvold triggers, gets a +1/+1 counter, and Ashani draws a card. He escapes Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices LED, adding 3 green. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. He casts Defense Grid. In response, Drake taps his Tarnished Citadel to help cast Eladamri's Call. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand, then Defense Grid resolves. Ashani moves to his end step, Mana Crypt re-enters, and he sacrifices Underworld Breach. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. The turn moves to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Drake creates 4 treasures. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. He adds 4 black. He follows up with an Intuition. He fetches up an Underworld Breach, Lion's Eye Diamond, and a Savine's Reclamation. Charles gives him LED. Drake casts Mox Amber. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Underworld Breach. Breach enters, Savine's copies, and Drake returns Dockside Extortionist to the battlefield. Dockside enters, and Drake creates 4 more treasures. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, adding 3 blue. He escapes Intuition. He fetches up a Brain Freeze, Final Fortune, and a Derevi Imperial Tactician. Charles gives him Derevi. Drake escapes Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself, milling some of his library. He escapes Brain Freeze again, milling the rest of his library. Drake escapes LED and then cracks it for 3 blue. Drake escapes Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, triggers, and Drake wins the game. Ashani draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch and passes the turn to Charles. Charles draws, plays a Snow-Covered Plains, and ends his turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Mana Vault. He ships the turn to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Bayou. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it to help cast his commander, Corvold, Fakehurst King. Corvold enters and Ashani sacrifices Ignoble Hierarch. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. With nothing else, Ashani passes. Charles draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He casts Durannith Magistrate. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Phyrexian Tower. He casts Buried Alive. He fetches up a Villas, Broker of Blood, Blood Celebrant, and a Flesh Writher into his graveyard. All set, he ends his turn. Drake draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Ragavan. Peter takes it, Ragavan triggers, Peter exiles Asmodeus the Archfiend, and Drake creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Drake plays a Tundra. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger enters, and Drake fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. Drake ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it and pays a life. Corvold triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Then Ashani fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Holding up mana, he passes to Charles. Charles draws and plays a snow-covered plains. He casts Spirit of the Labyrinth. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage from his mana vault. He plays a Swamp for turn. He casts Reanimate, targeting Villas, Broker of Blood. Reanimate resolves, and Peter loses 8 life. Villas triggers, and in response, Peter pays 2 life to activate Villas, targeting Spirit of the Labyrinth. Villas triggers again, but he cannot draw due to Spirit. Then Spirit dies, and the original Villas trigger resolves, and Peter draws 8 cards. Peter casts Lotus Petal. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Swamp. He casts Dance of the Dead, targeting Blood Celebrant. In response, Drake casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Dance of the Dead. Plans thwarted, Peter passes, discarding to hand size. Drake draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He moves to combat and attacks Charles with Ranger Captain. Charles takes it, and in his second main phase, Drake casts an Esper Sentinel. He ends the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 4 treasures. Ashani cracks his Marsh Flats and pays a life. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Then Ashani fetches up an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Corval. Corval triggers, and he sacrifices Dockside. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Drake takes 8, and in his second main phase, Ashani cracks a treasure, triggering Corval. After some deliberation among the table, Drake decides to sacrifice his Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then Corval's trigger resolves, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Ashani casts his own Ragavan. Locked out of non-creature spells and unable to continue, Ashani passes. Charles draws and plays a snow-covered plains. He casts an Academy Rector. The table stands to attention, and Charles gives the turn to Peter. During his draw step, Peter takes a damage from his mana vault. Villas triggers, and Peter draws. In his main phase, he casts Animate Dead, targeting Blood Celebrant. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Peter pays. In response, Ashani cracks 2 treasures and floats mana. Corval triggers twice, getting 2 counters, and Ashani draws 2 cards. Unfortunately, not finding any answers, Animate Dead resolves, putting Blood Celebrant onto the battlefield. Peter activates Celebrant, paying a life and adding a black. Villas triggers, and Peter draws. Peter activates Celebrant 9 more times, losing 9 life and drawing 9 cards through Villas. He plays a Swamp for turn. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He activates Blood Celebrant 6 more times, losing 6 life and drawing 6 more cards through Villas. Peter casts Sacrifice, sacrificing Villas as an additional cost. He adds 8 black. He casts Grim Monolith. He casts a Defense Grid. In response, Ashani cracks a treasure. Corval triggers, gets a counter, and Ashani draws. Then, unfortunately for the team, Defense Grid resolves. Peter casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse. He casts Shallow Grave, returning Villas from his graveyard to the battlefield. Peter activates Blood Celebrant, paying a life, adding a black, and drawing through Villas. Sheoldred triggers, and Peter gains 2 life. Peter presents a loop of paying life with Blood Celebrant, drawing a card with Villas, and gaining 2 life through Sheoldred. With this loop, he draws through his deck. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Grim Tutor. He casts Cabal Ritual, adding 5 black. He casts Professor Onyx. He follows up by casting Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Professor Onyx triggers, each opponent loses 2, and Peter gains 2. Chain of Smog resolves, Peter discards 2, and he copies Chain of Smog, targeting himself again. He presents a loop of copying Chain of Smog, triggering Professor Onyx each time to drain the table. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Nick wins the Ugly Sweater contest and gets to start us off. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts an Arbor Elf and passes the turn. Peter draws, plays a Swamp, and gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Professional Facebreaker. Mike ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays a Nurturing Peatland. He taps it to cast Elvish Mystic. He passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Sardian Avenger. He casts Dryad Militant. Nick ships the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Grim Monolith. Peter pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 4 life and casts a Grim Tutor. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter, and then Peter fetches up a card into his hand, losing 3 life. Then Grim Tutor's exiled through Dryad Militant. Peter pays 6 life and casts Necropotence. Kirik triggers and gets another counter. It resolves and he activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life and exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Peter passes, discarding to hand size, exiling the discarded cards. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Phoenix Chick. He moves to combat, attacking Peter with Facebreaker and Ashani with Phoenix Chick. They both take it, Facebreaker triggers, and Mike creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, Mike cracks a treasure and casts Ethersworn Canonist. Sardian Avenger triggers and Mike takes a damage. He plays Shatterskull, the Hammer Pass, into play tapped, and passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ashani creates 6 treasures. He ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Horizon Canopy. He taps it to help cast Grand Abolisher. Nick moves to combat and attacks Peter with 12 with his first striking, trampling Sardian Avenger. Peter is forced to block with Kirik and takes the rest. All through, Nick passes the turn to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter's Mana Crypt triggers. With his life on the line, he rolls and wins. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He plays a Swamp. He casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. Peter ships the turn to Mike. During his upkeep, Mike wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he loses 2 life through Sheoldred. He plays a Mana Confluence for turn. He taps it to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner of Forces. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Facebreaker and Ashani with Phoenix Chick. Winota triggers, and in response, Peter saves himself from death by activating Top, drawing a card, and putting Top on top, gaining 2 life through Sheoldred. Then Mike looks at the top 6 and puts a Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield tapped and attacking Ashani. Zealous Conscripts triggers and Mike gains control of Necropotence. Ashani blocks Conscripts with Dockside, and then they both take the rest. Facebreaker triggers and Mike creates 2 treasures. In his second main phase, he activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life, exiling 7 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, Necropotence goes back under Peter's control, and then he discards the hand size. Ashani draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He cracks 6 treasures, taking 6 damage from Sardian Avenger, and then casts Culling Ritual. In response, Nick activates Arbor Elf, untapping Savannah. In response, Peter cracks Jeweled Lotus and takes a damage from Sardian Avenger. Mike activates Facebreaker, sacrificing a treasure, exiling Amaria's Call off of the top of his library, taking a damage from the Avenger. Mike activates Facebreaker again, exiling Loyal Apprentice. Avenger triggers and Mike takes another damage. Mike cracks a treasure and adds a white. Avenger triggers and he takes another damage. With no other responses, Ashani's Culling Ritual resolves, destroying all non-land permanents 2 or less, and he has 4 green and 7 black. Ashani casts Ad Nauseam. With no responses, it resolves. Ashani reveals a Grinding Station, Autumn's Veil, Grim Monolith, Stomping Ground, Verdant Catacombs, Gamble, Imperial Seal, Overgrown Tomb, City of Brass, Elvish Spirit Guide, Badlands, Mayhem Devil, Arid Mesa, Culling the Weak, Demonic Tutor, Squandered Resources, and a Mana Vault, deciding to stop there. Ashani casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Demonic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Grinding Station. Since Grinding Station sees itself entering, its second ability triggers. So in response, Ashani sacrifices his Mana Vault and mills 3 cards. Then Grinding Station untaps. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Squandered Resources. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. It enters and Grinding Station triggers. In response, he activates Station, sacrificing his LED and milling 3. Ashani escapes LED. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He cracks LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. He escapes LED again. Ashani presents a loop of activating Grinding Station, sacrificing LED, milling 3 cards, then escaping LED to untap Grinding Station. He does this until he mills a Twin Flame. He escapes Ignoble Hierarch. He escapes Twin Flame, targeting the Hierarch. He holds priority and escapes Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster enters and triggers, targeting Twin Flame. In response, Nick attempts to stop the inevitability by casting Path to Exile, targeting Dualcaster Mage. In response, Ashani escapes Deflecting Swat. Swat resolves, redirecting Path of Exile to Ignoble Hierarch. Hierarch is exiled, and Ashani declines to search. With no other responses, Dualcaster creates a copy of Twin Flame. Twin Flame targets Dualcaster, creating another copy. Ashani presents a loop of creating infinite hasty Dualcasters through Twin Flame. He moves to combat and attacks each opponent, and Ashani wins the game. But Ashani has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Blood Crypt. Peter draws for turn and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Jet Medallion. He passes. Mike draws and plays a Spectator Seeding. He casts a Mana Vault. He ends his turn. Ashani draws, plays a Wooded Foothills, and ships the turn to Nick. Nick draws and also plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He passes the turn. At the end of Nick's turn, Ashani cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He taps his Ancient Tomb and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 2 life to cast Dark Ritual. Esper triggers and Nick draws a card. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. He then adds 3 black. Peter pays 4 life and casts Flesh Writher. Kirik triggers and gets another counter. He pays 2 life and casts Wishclaw Talisman. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. He pays 4 life to transfigure Flesh Writher, fetching up a Violent Tumor onto the battlefield. Violent Tumor triggers and Peter fetches up a Villas, Broker of Blood, into his graveyard. He activates Wishclaw Talisman, fetches up a card into his hand, and then gives Wishclaw to Nick. Peter casts Reanimate, targeting Villas. Kirik triggers and gets another counter. Reanimate resolves and Villas returns to the battlefield and he loses 8 life. Villas triggers and he draws 8 cards. Peter casts Mox Diamond, discarding Urza's Saga. He casts a Mana Vault. He pays 4 life and casts Dark Petition with Spell Mastery. Villas triggers and Peter draws 4. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Dark Petition resolves, Peter fetches up a card into his hand and then adds 3 black. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Imp's Mischief. He casts Grey Merchant of Asphodel and Kirik gets a counter. It enters and each opponent loses 10 life and Peter gains 30. Peter pays 2 life and casts Blood Pet. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Villas triggers and he draws 2 cards. He pays 4 life and casts Dauthi Voidwalker. Kirik triggers, gets a counter, then Villas triggers and he draws 4. Peter pays 4 life to activate Villas, targeting Esper Sentinel. He holds priority and does this again 3 more times. Villas triggers and Peter draws 16 cards. The abilities resolve and Nick's Esper Sentinel dies. Peter pays 2 life and casts Sacrifice, sacrificing Grey Merchant as an additional cost. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Villas triggers and Peter draws 2 cards. It resolves and Peter adds 5 black. He pays 2 life to cast Dance of the Dead. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. Villas triggers and he draws 2. Dance resolves and Peter reanimates Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Merchant enters and each opponent loses 14 life and Peter gains 42. He casts a Demonic Tutor. Kirik triggers and gains a counter, and Peter fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Saw in Half, targeting Grey Merchant. Kirik triggers and gains another counter. Saw in Half resolves and Peter creates 2 copies of Grey Merchant. They both trigger, draining his opponents for 30 life, and Peter wins the game. But Ashani has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Overgrown Tomb. Mike draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast Signal Pest. He casts an Ornithopter. He passes the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He ends his turn. Nick draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts a Deafening Silence. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Soul Ring and passes. Mike draws and plays a Needle Verge Pathway. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Goblin Rabble Master. He moves to combat, Rabble Master triggers, and Mike creates a 1/1 Goblin with haste. He attacks Peter with the Goblin, Ornithopter, and Signal Pest. Signal Pest's Battlecry triggers, buffing Mike's other creatures. Peter takes the damage, and in his second main phase, Mike casts Rograk, Son of Roga. Mike passes the turn. At the end of Mike's turn, Ashani cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. Ashani draws and plays a City of Traders. He casts a Witchclaw Talisman. He activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetches up a card into his hand, and then gives the Witchclaw to Peter. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 5 treasures. He casts his commander, Corvold, Fakehurst King. Corvold enters, and Ashani sacrifices Dockside. Corvold triggers, he gets a 1/1 counter, and Ashani draws a card. He ships the turn to Nick. Nick draws and plays a Brushland. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He taps his Brushland to help cast Weathered Wayfarer. Nick passes the turn. Peter draws and casts Reanimate, targeting Dockside in Ashani's graveyard. Dockside enters, and Peter loses 2 life. Dockside triggers, and Peter creates 3 treasures. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a City of Brass. He moves to combat, Rabble Master triggers, and he creates a Goblin. In response, Peter pays 2 life to cast Cut Down, targeting Signal Pest. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Signal Pest dies, and Mike attacks Nick with his 2 goblins. Nick takes it, and with nothing else, Mike passes the turn. During Ashani's upkeep, Peter casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Corvold. Kirik triggers and gets a counter. In response, Ashani flashes in a Dualcaster Mage. Dualcaster enters and creates a copy of Deadly Relic, targeting Kirik. Both relics resolve, and Kirik and Corvold are exiled. Ashani draws and casts Skirk Prospector. He ships the turn. Nick draws and plays a Gaia's Cradle. He taps his Brushland to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. Ranger enters, and Nick fetches up a Birds of Paradise into his hand. He casts Birds of Paradise and moves to combat. He attacks Mike with Ragavan. Mike takes it, Ragavan triggers, Mike exiles Blade Historian, and Nick creates a treasure. Nick passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws and activates Witchclaw Talisman. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives the Witchclaw to Ashani. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Peter pays 6 life and recasts his commander, Kirik, Son of Yawgmoth. Finished up, he passes. At the end of Peter's turn, Mike taps the City of Brass to help cast Path to Exile, targeting his own Goblin token. Goblin is exiled, and Mike fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. Everyone knowing that this is how White ramps, they take pity on Mike, and he moves to his turn. Mike draws and casts a Mana Crypt. He taps the City of Brass to help cast his commander, Winota, Joiner Forces. Mike moves to combat, and in response, Nick activates Weathered Wayfarer, fetching up a Beseju who endures into his hand. Then Rabble Master triggers, creating another Goblin. Mike attacks Nick with the Goblin Rabble Master, Ornithopter, Rograk, and 2 goblins. Rabble Master triggers, and Winota triggers 5 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Glow Rider onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. Mike looks at the next 6 and fails to find. He looks at the next 6, putting Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani as well. He looks at the next 6, putting Professional Facebreaker onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Peter. He looks at the final 6, putting Cathar Commando onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. Then Rabble Master gets +2/+L. Ashani blocks with Dualcaster Mage, and Nick blocks a Goblin with Ranger Captain, and then they take the rest. Facebreaker triggers, and Mike creates 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Mike activates Cathar Commando, sacrificing it, destroying Witchclaw Talisman. With nothing else, Mike ships the turn. Ashani draws, casts a Mana Crypt, and passes to Nick. Nick draws and taps his Brushland to help cast his commander, Jetmir, Nexus of Rebels. He casts Tealani Summoner. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Ragavan and Ashani with Ranger Captain. They both take it, Ragavan triggers, and Mike exiles Ranger Captain of Eos, and Nick creates a treasure. In his second main phase, he activates Weathered Wayfarer and fetches up a Taiga into his hand. Nick plays a Taiga and passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws and pays 4 life to cast Balthor the Defiled. Keurig triggers and gets a counter. He ends the turn. During his upkeep, Mike loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. Rabble Master triggers, creating a Goblin. He attacks Nick with Glow Rider and Ashani with 2 Goblins, Facebreaker, Ornithopter, Rograk, Thalia, and Goblin Rabble Master. Rabble Master triggers and Winota triggers 5 times. Mike looks at the top 6 and puts Mogcatcher onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. He looks at the next 6 and puts Zealous Conscripts onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Peter. Conscripts triggers and Mike gains control of Jetmir. Mike looks at the next 6 and fails to find. He looks at another 6 and puts Sanctum Prelate onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Ashani. As it enters, Mike names 2. Mike looks at the top 6 one last time, putting Myrel, Shield of Argive, onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking Peter. Then Rabble Master gets +2/+0. They all take it, and both Ashani and Peter die. Facebreaker triggers, creating 6 treasures. In his second main phase, Mike activates Facebreaker and exiles Ethersworn Canonist off of the top of his library. He activates Facebreaker again and exiles Combat Celebrant. He activates Facebreaker and exiles Giver of Runes. He does it one more time and exiles Flooded Strand. He plays a Flooded Strand from exile. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. Mike casts Combat Celebrant from exile. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Ranger Captain of Eos. It's exiled and Nick gains 3 life. Mike casts Ethersworn Canonist. With nothing else, he passes the turn. Nick draws and plays a Beseju, who endures as his land for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with everything. Tealani triggers and Nick pays 10 mana into its ability, creating 9 elementals, tapped and attacking Mike. Tealani triggers and Nick gets the City's Blessing. Unfortunately, Mike left his shields down, and since now the elementals have +3/+0, Vigilance, Trample, and Double Strike, Mike takes it all, dies, and Nick wins the game. Peter had the coolest sleeves at the table, so he gets to start us off. Peter draws a card for turn and plays a Swamp. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices it and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Off to a good start, he ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. He passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Mox Amber. He gives the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Finehorn Elves. He casts Mox Amber. He passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Crystal Vein. He pays 2 life to help cast Buried Alive. Kirik triggers, and in response, Alex casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing his tropical island, countering Buried Alive. Then Kirik gets a +1/+1 counter, and Peter moves to combat. He attacks Alex with Kirik. Alex takes the hit, Peter gains 3, and ends his turn. Cal draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Ragavan. Peter takes it, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm, then another through Ragavan, and then Peter exiles Chain of Smog. With 1 combo piece removed, Cal passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Eldritch Evolution. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 2, targeting Peter. Invasion of Ikoria enters, and Sean fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters, and in response, Cal sacks his 2 treasures. Then Sean creates 2 of his own. He sacrifices his treasures and his Chrome Mox as an additional cost to help cast his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. All through, he ships the turn. Alex draws and plays a tropical island. He casts his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, and then passes the turn. Peter draws, plays a Swamp, and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm and Alex with Ragavan. They both take the damage, and Ragavan and Malcolm trigger. Cal creates 2 treasures through Malcolm, then another through Ragavan, and then Alex exiles Basalt Monolith. Cal lets out a series of hoots with another combo piece removed, and he moves to his second main phase. He casts a Spellskite. He passes the turn to Sean. Sean draws and plays a command tower. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dargo. Peter takes the hit, and Sean ships the turn to Alex. Alex draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. He casts Glen Elendra Archmage. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Pact of Negation into his hand. Glen Elendra resolves, and Alex passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Lotus Petal, paying the Rhystic tax. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm and Alex with Ragavan. Alex blocks Ragavan with Glen Elendra. Peter takes the hit, Glen Elendra and Ragavan trade, then Malcolm and Glen Elendra trigger. Alex returns Glen Elendra to the battlefield through Persist, and Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm. Cal, having nothing better to do, thinks about casting Tana, but decides to pass the turn. Sean draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Dargo. In response, Peter casts Saw in Half, targeting Dargo, and Alex draws through Rhystic. Keurig triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Then Saw in Half resolves, destroying Dargo, and Sean creates 2 miniaturized Dargo tokens, sacking 1 to the legendary rule. All through, Sean ships this wreck to Alex. Alex draws, plays an island, and passes the turn to Peter. Peter draws, takes no actions, and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Malcolm. Peter takes the hit, Cal creates a treasure through Malcolm, and then he passes his turn. At the end of Cal's turn, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a City of Brass onto the battlefield tapped. Sean draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. With nothing else, he ends his turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Alex taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, but fails to find. Alex draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He casts a Lotus Petal. He activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Phantasmal Image onto the battlefield. Phantasmal Image enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside triggers, and in response, Peter sacrifices his Lotus Petal, and Cal sacrifices his 5 treasures. Then Alex creates 4 treasures through Dockside. Alex casts Wandering Archaic. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor, paying the Rhystic tax. Keurig triggers and gains a counter. In response, Sean activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Dispel into his hand. Sean then casts Dispel, countering Vampiric Tutor, and Alex draws through Rhystic. With Archaic still in the stack, Sean puts on his Table Police badge and casts Pact of Negation, targeting Wandering Archaic. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. In response, Alex taps Waterlogged Grove to help cast Crop Rotation, sacrificing Grove as an additional cost, fetching up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. Then Pact resolves, countering Wandering Archaic. Alex activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts a Consecrated Sphinx onto the battlefield. Sitting pretty, he ships the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Cal casts Veil of Summer, paying for Rhystic. Cal draws a card, then Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx, and then they move to Peter's turn. Peter draws, and Alex draws 2 through Consecrated Sphinx. He does nothing else and gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws, and Alex draws 2 through Sphinx. Cal moves to combat and attacks Sean with Malcolm. Sean takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Cal creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Cal casts Corridor Monitor, paying for Rhystic. In response, Peter sacrifices his Crystal Vein to hard cast Snuff Out, targeting Consecrated Sphinx, paying the Rhystic tax. Keurig triggers and gets a counter. Alex, not wanting to lose his Golden Goose, casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Snuff Out. In response, Sean taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to help activate Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Swan Song into his hand. Sphinx triggers and Alex draws 2. In response to Fierce Guardianship, Cal casts Spell Pierce, targeting Fierce. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Then Spell Pierce counters Fierce, Snuff Out destroys Consecrated Sphinx, and Corridor Monitor resolves. Monitor enters and Cal untaps his Sol Ring. All through, Cal passes the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He sacrifices his Dargo token, Thrasios, Mox Amber, and Sol Ring as an additional cost, and recasts his commander, Dargo. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws. Sean casts Life's Legacy, sacrificing Dargo as an additional cost. Rhystic triggers and Alex draws again. In response, Alex sacrifices Glen Elendra, countering Life's Legacy. Sean, not wanting Dargo's cost reduction to go to waste, again casts Dargo the Shipwrecker, and Alex draws through Rhystic. He gives the turn to Alex. During Alex's upkeep, Cal casts March of Swirling Mist, where X equals 1, targeting Kinnan, paying the Rhystic tax. In response, Alex activates Kinnan, looks at the top 5, and puts Jin-Gitaxias, Progress Tyrant, onto the battlefield. March resolves, and Kinnan phases out. Alex draws for turn and plays a command tower. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts Lawan, Cephalid Empress. Empress enters, bouncing Malcolm and Corridor Monitor back to Kyle's hand. Alex passes, discarding to hand size. Peter draws, takes no actions, and ships the turn. Cal draws and pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Alex. Jin-Gitaxias, Rhystic, and Mystic all trigger. Alex draws through Mystic and Rhystic, then Jin-Gitaxias counters Gitaxian Probe. Cal, getting ready to be roasted in the comments, gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws and moves to combat. He attacks the Invasion of Ikoria with Dargo. He defeats it, the invasion is exiled, and then Sean casts the backside, Zilortha, Apex of Ikoria, paying for Rhystic. He passes the turn to Alex. Before Alex is untapped, Kinnan phases back in. During his upkeep, he pays for his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help activate Nykthos, adding 7 blue. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 10. Ginge attacks his triggers and creates a copy of Finale. In response, Sean casts Swansong, targeting the original Finale of Devastation. Ginge attacks us, Rhystic, and Mystic all trigger. Alex draws through Mystic, Sean pays for Rhystic, and Ginge attacks us, counter Swansong. Sean then taps his City of Brass and his Mana Confluence to help hardcast Mindbreak Trap, targeting both Finales. Rhystic and Mystic both trigger, and Alex draws. In response, Alex casts Delay, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Cal, wanting to make up for his previous play, casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Delay, paying for Rhystic. Mystic triggers, and Alex draws. Alex refuses the offer and pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting an Offer You Can't Refuse. The table, out of answers, resigns to their fate. Misstep counters Offer, Delay counters and suspends Mindbreak Trap with 3 time counters, then the first copy of Finale of Devastation resolves. Alex fetches up a Hullbreaker Horror onto the battlefield. The original Finale resolves, and he fetches up a Deadeye Navigator onto the battlefield. Deadeye enters and soul bonds with Phantasmal Image. Alex presents a loop of activating Phantasmal Image's new ability to exile it, return to the battlefield as a Dockside Extortionist, create 2 treasures, then crack a treasure to create 2 mana through Kennen to again blink Phantasmal Image. He does this until he has infinite treasures. Alex then activates Kennen until he puts Thrasios Triton Hero onto the battlefield. He uses his infinite treasures to draw his deck. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Alex wins the game. Peter opens the One Ring to rule them all and gets to start us off. Peter draws for turn and plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. He passes. Sean draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts a Chrome Mox, Imprinting Spellseeker. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He ships the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He taps his Windswept Teeth for a black through Urborg. He casts Demonic Consultation. In response, Peter casts Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Demonic Consultation resolves and Mike names Mana Crypt. He exiles cards from his library until he reveals a Mana Crypt, putting them into his hand. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Talisman of Dominance. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He casts Chrome Mox, Imprinting Red Elemental Blast. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Mana Vault. He casts Jaxus the Troublemaker. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He sacrifices Jeweled Lotus and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 2 life through Kirik to help cast Buried Alive. Kirik triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He fetches up a Hoarding Broodlord, Vilis Broker of Blood, and a Razaketh the Foulblooded into his graveyard. He pays 2 life to cast Reanimate, targeting Vilis. Kirik triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. Vilis enters and Peter loses 8 life. Vilis triggers and Peter draws 8 cards. He activates Vilis twice, paying 8 life through Kirik, targeting Jaxus. Vilis triggers and Peter draws 8. Then Jaxus gets -2/-2. He casts Mox Amber. He pays 2 life to cast Cabal Ritual. Kirik gets a counter. Peter draws 2 through Vilis, then adds 3 black. He pays 2 life to help cast Demonic Tutor. Kirik gets a counter. Peter draws 2, then he fetches up a card into his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Sacrifice, sacrificing Vilis as an additional cost. Kirik gets a counter. Peter draws 2 through Vilis, and then he adds 8 black. He casts Exhume. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter returns Vilis to the battlefield. He pays 2 life to cast Wishclaw Talisman. Kirik gets a counter, and Peter draws 2 through Vilis. He activates Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Ryan. He pays 2 life to cast Grey Merchant of Asphodel. Kirik gets a counter, Peter draws 2 through Vilis, and Grey Merchant resolves. It enters, and each opponent loses 8 life, and Peter gains 24. He casts Grim Monolith. He pays 4 life to cast Dark Petition. Kirik gets a counter, Peter draws 4 cards through Vilis, and then Dark Petition resolves. He fetches up a card into his hand and adds 3 black. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Grey Merchant of Asphodel as an additional cost. Kirik gets a counter, and then Peter adds 4 black. He pays 4 life to help cast Professor Onyx. Kirik gets a counter, Peter draws 4 through Vilis, and then Onyx resolves. He pays 2 life to cast Chain of Smog, targeting himself. Kirik, Vilis, and Professor Onyx triggers. Each opponent loses 2 and Peter gains 2. He draws 2 through Vilis, then Kirik gets a counter. Peter presents a loop of copying Chain of Smog, targeting himself, discarding 2 cards, and Professor Onyx triggering each time. He does this over and over, draining his opponents until they are dead, and Peter wins the game. Sean draws for turn and was punished for his super risky keep. He takes no game actions and passes to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He taps it to help cast Esper Sentinel. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts Birds of Paradise. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts Mox Opal. Esper Sentinel triggers and Ryan pays. He ships the turn. Peter draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He gives the turn to Sean. Sean draws, again takes no game actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. Mike draws and moves to combat. He attacks Peter with Esper Sentinel. Peter takes it, and in his second main phase, Mike plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Nigila the Blade Blossom. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts a Felwar Stone. Esper Sentinel triggers and Mike draws. He ends this turn. Peter draws and plays a swamp. He casts Dark Ritual and Mike draws through Esper. Then Peter adds 3 black. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Buried Alive. He fetches up Razaketh the Foul-Blooded, Villas Broker of Blood, and a Hoarding Broodlord into his graveyard. He casts Mana Crypt. He pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He ends his turn. Sean draws and finally finds what he needed. He plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Tinderwall. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts a Soul Ring, and Mike draws through Esper. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Birgi, God of Storytelling. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts a Mystic Remora. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and Mike creates 6 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Najeela and Ryan with Esper Sentinel. Najeela triggers and Mike creates a warrior tapped and attacking Ryan. Both players declare no blocks and in response, Mike activates Najeela. He untaps his creatures and they gain lifelink, trample, and haste. Then Mike gets an additional combat. Peter and Ryan take the hit and Mike gains 5. He moves to his additional combat and attacks Peter with Najeela and Ryan with a warrior and Esper Sentinel. Najeela triggers, creating 2 warriors tapped and attacking Ryan. Peter and Ryan take the hit and Mike gains 5 again. Mike passes. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts his own Dockside Extortionist. In response, Mike sacrifices 3 treasures to add a blue, green, and a white. Dockside enters and Ryan creates 5 treasures. He casts a Metalworker. He ships the turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and pays 4 life to help cast Final Parting. Kirik, Remora, and Esper trigger. Mike and Sean both draw, and in response to Kirik, Ryan casts Thunderclap for its alternate cost, sacrificing a mountain targeting Kirik. Remora and Esper trigger, Ryan pays for Esper, and Sean draws off of Remora. Then Kirik dies, and Final Parting resolves. Peter fetches up a card into his hand and Grey Merchant of Asphodel into his graveyard. Severely set back, he gives the turn to Sean. During his upkeep, Sean lets his Remora die. He draws and casts a Mana Crypt, letting Mike draw through Esper. He casts Imperial Recruiter. Recruiter enters and Sean fetches up his own Dockside Extortionist into his hand. He casts Dockside. In response, Ryan sacrifices 2 treasures, adding 2 red. Dockside enters and Sean creates 7 treasures. He casts an Underworld Breach. He escapes Birgi, God of Storytelling. He casts Goblin Bombardment. Birgi triggers and Sean adds a red. He casts his commander, Dargo, the Shipwrecker, reduced through his treasures. Birgi triggers and Sean adds a red again. He sacrifices Dargo through Bombardment, dealing 1 damage to Peter. He recasts Dargo, adding a red through Birgi. Sean presents a loop of sacrificing Dargo through Goblin Bombardment, dealing a damage to an opponent, then recasting it, reduced through the previous sacrifice, adding a red through Birgi each time. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Sean wins the game. Mike draws for turn and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts a Rhystic Study. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He sacrifices his Lotus to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. With a crazy start out of the gate, Mike passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mox Diamond. Rhystic Study triggers and Ryan pays. Diamond resolves and he discards a Gemstone Caverns. He gives the turn to Peter. Peter draws and casts Jeweled Lotus, letting Mike draw. He plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb, sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus, and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws again. Peter pays 4 life to cast Dauthi Voidwalker. Kirik and Rhystic trigger, Mike draws, and Kirik gets a counter. He pays 2 life to help cast Witchclaw Talisman. Mike draws, and Kirik gets another counter. With nothing else, Peter ships the turn. Sean draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He casts no spells and passes. At the end of Sean's turn, he reminds everyone to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment about your favorite part of tonight's game. Mike draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Najeela. Najeela triggers and Mike creates a warrior tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike casts a Soul Ring. He ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and ships the turn. Peter draws and taps Ancient Tomb to help activate Wishclaw. He fetches up a card into his hand and gives the Monkey's Paw to Ryan. He pays 2 life to help cast Cabal Ritual. Kirik and Rhystic trigger, Mike draws, and Kirik gets a counter. Then Peter adds 3 black. He casts Balthor the Defiled, letting Mike draw and putting a 1/1 counter on Kirik. In response, Sean cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. In a bold move, Sean casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Rhystic Study, trying to force Mike to interact. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. In response, Mike casts Snap, targeting Dauthi Voidwalker. Dauthi bounces and Mike untaps 2 lands. Still in response to Chain, Mike casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Chain of Vapor. Swat resolves and Mike changes the target of Chain to Kirik. Chain resolves, bouncing Kirik. In another bold move, Peter sacrifices Ancient Tomb to copy the Chain, targeting Rhystic Study again. Rhystic gets bounced and Mike ends the chain. Then Balthor finally resolves. Next, Peter casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Knowing that this is a huge problem, Sean responds by casting Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling LED. With his plans foiled, Peter passes the turn. Sean draws and plays Beseiju, who endures. He casts an Arcane Signet. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Najeela and his warrior token. Najeela triggers, creating 2 warriors tapped and attacking Ryan. Ryan takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Mike recasts Rhystic Study. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He activates Witchclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw back to Peter. He casts Dockside Extortionist, paying for Rhystic. Dockside enters and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He casts Treasonous Ogre, letting Mike draw through Rhystic. In response, Mike casts Silence. Silence resolves, then Treasonous Ogre resolves. Unable to cast any spells, Ryan ends his turn. Peter draws, takes no game actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Sean casts Worldly Tutor, letting Mike draw through Rhystic. He fetches up his own Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. He draws and casts Dockside. Mike draws through Rhystic, Dockside resolves, and Sean creates 4 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Mike with Ragavan. Mike takes it, Ragavan triggers, Sean creates a treasure, and Mike exiles a Final Fortune. In his second main phase, Sean casts Dargo, sacrificing Ragavan, Dockside, and a treasure as an additional cost. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. He casts Jessica's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Mike, paying for Rhystic. In response, Mike casts Demonic Consultation. It resolves and Mike names Fierce Guardianship. He exiles the top 6, then exiles all but the last 10 cards, putting Fierce Guardianship into his hand. He casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Jessica's Will. With nothing else, Sean gives the turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding Gemstone Caverns. He casts Grand Abolisher. With no answers, it resolves, locking out opponents. He taps Tarnished Citadel to help cast a Tinderwall. He casts Talisman of Curiosity. He sacrifices Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Samut, Vizier of Noctamoon. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Najeela, Samut, and 3 of his warriors. Najeela triggers, creating 5 warriors tapped and attacking Peter. Peter blocks one of the new warriors with Balthor and takes the rest. Samut triggers 5 times and Mike draws 5 cards. Mike sighs because he still cannot find his Thassa's Oracle. In his second main phase, he casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Mystic Remora. He ships the turn. Ryan draws and casts Curse Mirror. Esper and Remora trigger, and Mike draws 2. Mike knows that this is a Dockside Extortionist and pleads with the table to counter it. No one does, and Curse Mirror resolves. Mirror enters as a Grand Abolisher. With the table now locked out, Ryan activates Treasonous Ogre, paying 3 life, adding a red. He casts Grim Monolith, and Mike declines his Rhystic triggers. Ryan activates Treasonous Ogre, paying 9 life, adding 3 red. He casts his commander, Godo, Bandit Warlord. Godo enters, and Ryan fetches up a Hammer of Nazan onto the battlefield. Hammer triggers, and Ryan equips it to Godo. He pays 12 life to activate Treasonous Ogre, adding 4 red. He casts Helm of the Host. It enters, Hammer triggers, and Ryan equips Helm to Godo. He moves to combat, creating a copy of Godo. He attacks Sean with Godo, getting in additional combat. Sean takes it, and Ryan moves to his extra combat, creating another Godo. He repeats this process to get infinite combat steps, killing the table, and Ryan wins the game. Ashani won the Nymar challenge and gets to start us off. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Alex draws and plays an island. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts a Mox Amber. He passes. Peter draws and plays a Swamp. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Peter ends his turn. Ryan draws, plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Ashani cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mystic Remora. Ashani ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Waterlogged Grove. He taps it to help cast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. Alex ships the turn. At the end of Alex's turn, Peter pays 4 life to cast Dismember, targeting Kinnan. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Alex casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing an island as an additional cost. Remora triggers and Ashani draws again. Then Alex fetches up a City of Traders onto the battlefield. He casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Dismember. Ashani draws from Remora, and Flusterstorm counters Dismember. Still in the end step, Alex activates Kinnan. He looks at the top 5, putting an Elvish Mystic onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Crystal Vein. He casts Heartless Summoning. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. He cracks Crystal Vein and pays 6 life to help cast his commander, Kirik, son of Yawgmoth. He pays 4 life to transmute Dimir Houseguard. In response, Ashani taps Mana Confluence to help flash in an opposition agent. It resolves, then Ashani fetches up the One Ring from Peter's library into exile. Unfortunately blown out, Peter ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting his first counter. He passes. During his upkeep, Ashani pays to keep his Remora. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scrubland. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Opposition Agent. Ryan takes it, and in his second main phase, Ashani taps his Mana Confluence to cast an Overloaded Dam. All creatures are destroyed, and Peter puts Kirik into the graveyard. Ashani ends his turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps his Waterlogged Grove to help recast his commander, Kinnan. He casts Wandering Archaic. Alex passes. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Diabolic Tutor. Remora and Wandering Archaic trigger. Alex copies Diabolic Tutor, fetching up a card into his hand. Then Ashani draws from Remora, then Peter fetches up a card into his hand. Peter ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a City of Traders for turn. He casts the One Ring. Remora triggers, and Ashani draws. It resolves, and Ryan gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a burn counter and drawing a card. Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Ashani lets his Remora die. He also loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and Ashani fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Godless Shrine onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Esper Sentinel. Ashani passes, discarding to hand size. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. Also in Alex's upkeep, Ashani sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Alex draws and pays 2 life to cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of the One Ring, and Alex gains protection from everything. Alex activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing a card. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Wandering Archaic. Peter takes it, and Alex ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Jeweled Lotus, paying the Esper tax. He casts Flesh Writher. Peter ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses a life to the One Ring. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats a mana, then sacrificing it, fetching up a Grafdigger's Cage onto the battlefield. He activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He casts Chrome Mox, paying for Esper. It enters, and Ryan imprints Anya's Ravager. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts a Goblin Matron. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. All through, Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Rogue as it enters. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Alex flashes in a Frilled Mystic. During his upkeep, Alex loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He loses a life to the One Ring, then activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 2 cards. He draws and taps Waterlogged Grove to help cast Deadeye Navigator. It enters and Soul Bonds to Frilled Mystic. The table straps in, and Alex passes to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Ryan loses 2 life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring. He adds a counter and draws 3. He casts Hammer of Nazan. Esper triggers, and Ashani draws. It enters and equips to Goblin Matron. Ryan plays a Snow-Covered Mountain, sacrificing City of Traders as it enters. He casts Conqueror's Flail. It enters, Hammer triggers, and Ryan equips Flail to Goblin Matron. Finished up, Ryan passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Lotus Petal. He casts Portable Hole. It enters and exiles Kinnan. Next, Ashani uses Cavern of Souls to cast an uncounterable Tivit, Seller of Secrets. It enters, and Ashani creates 2 treasures and 3 clues. Ashani ships the turn. During his upkeep, Alex wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also loses 2 life from the One Ring. Still in his upkeep, he activates the One Ring, adding a counter and drawing 3. He draws and casts a Springleaf Drum. Esper triggers, and Ashani draws. He taps Waterlogged Grove to help recast his commander, Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. After some deliberation among the table, Kinnan resolves. Next, Alex casts Spellskite. After some more deliberation, Spellskite resolves. He plays a Treasure Vault for turn, sacrificing City of Traders as it enters. He casts a Simic Signet. Alex passes. At the end of Alex's turn, Peter hardcasts Deadly Rollick, targeting Spellskite. Esper and Wandering Archaic trigger. Alex creates a copy, targeting Goblin Matron. Matron is exiled, then Ashani draws through Esper, then Spellskite is exiled. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Grey Merchant of Asphodel. It enters, each opponent loses 5, and Peter gains 15. He ends his turn. At the end of Peter's turn, Ryan casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Frilled Mystic, paying the Esper tax. Wandering Archaic triggers, Alex copies it, targeting Esper Sentinel, killing it. In response, Alex activates Deadeye's ability, flickering Frilled Mystic, countering Lightning Bolt. The turn moves to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses 3 life to the One Ring. He draws and activates the One Ring. He adds a counter and draws 4 cards. He plays a Snow-Covered Mountain for turn. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ryan creates 17 treasures. He activates Conqueror's Flail, targeting Dockside. In response, Ashani improvises Whir of Invention. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Alex copies it. Then Alex fetches up an Arcane Signet onto the battlefield. Then Ashani fetches up an Imposter Mech onto the battlefield. And enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside triggers, and Ashani creates 33 treasures. With the equip still on the stack, Ashani casts Mystical Tutor, Archaic triggers, and Ashani pays. Then Ashani fetches up a Silence onto the top of his library. He cracks a clue and draws a card. Then Ashani casts Silence, Archaic triggers, and Ashani pays. With no answers, Silence resolves. With the equip still on the stack, Ashani casts Enlightened Tutor, paying for Archaic. He fetches up a Time Sieve onto the top of his library. Then with nothing else, the equip resolves. Ryan equips Hammer of Nazan onto Dockside. Locked out of doing anything else, Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Ashani channels Otawara, Soaring City, bouncing Wandering Archaic back to Alex's hand. Still in the end step, he cracks 2 clues and draws 2 cards. The turn moves to Ashani. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Tundra. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Tivit. Ryan takes it, Tivit triggers, and Ashani creates 2 clues and 3 treasures. In his second main phase, Ashani casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Imposter Mech. Mech is bounced, Ashani sacks a land, copying the chain, targeting Deadeye Navigator. Deadeye is bounced, Alex sacks a land, copying the chain, targeting Dockside, so Ashani cannot copy it again. Dockside is bounced, Ryan sacks a land, copying the chain, targeting Tivit. Ward triggers, and Ryan pays 3. Tivit is bounced, and Ashani stops the chain. Next, Ashani casts Imposter Mech. It enters as a copy of Kinnan. He casts Transmute Artifact. He sacrifices Portable Hole, fetching up a Witchclaw Talisman onto the battlefield, paying the difference. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Peter. He casts Grand Abolisher. With no answers, Abolisher resolves. Ashani taps Mana Confluence to cast Time Sieve. He recasts his commander, Tivit. It enters, and Ashani creates 2 clues and 3 treasures. Ashani activates Time Sieve, sacrificing his Mana Crypt and 4 treasures, getting an extra turn. Ashani presents a loop of taking extra turns, attacking with Tivit, creating artifacts, then sacking them to Time Sieve to take another turn. He does this over and over until the table is dead, and Ashani wins the game.